Hello, today I want to talk to you about figurative language. What do we mean when we use figurative language? First off, we think about figurative language when we think of its opposite, which is referential language, right? In Spanish, we speak of sentido figurado, right? Que no corresponde al literal de una palabra. Y el opuesto de literal es propio, ¿sí? Dicho del sentido... Número 6, dicho del sentido de una palabra principal o fundamental por oposición a figurado, right? In English, we can use figurative as opposed to literal, but there are many other terms, right? We also use referential, referential meaning, propositional meaning, denotative meaning, denotational meaning, cognitive meaning, conceptual meaning, and ideational meaning, that depending on different theories, right? And they're not exact synonyms. For figurative, we also use other words, typically metaphorical or connotative or affective, extended, associative, attitudinal, emotive, subjective meaning. Now, we're going to stay with figurative and referential or literal. That is to say, instead of using the actual words, we use something else to recreate an image that supposedly is going to help us understand better. As it says here, he exploded with rage, gives an idea of rage as an explosion, right? Figurative meaning, for Merriam-Webster, we're going to take sense two, expressing one thing in terms normally denoting another with which it may be regarded as analogous, metaphorical, so figurative language in a figurative sense. Now, I hope you have been able to remember by now that this is analogy, right? Analogy is the core of cognition. The very first mental process in order to understand something is to draw an analogy, to say, okay, rage is similar, can be, in one sense, can be compared to an explosion. Why? Well, we can understand, right? We can relate to that idea. So what happens is that when we use figurative language, we are drawing an inference. I would like first to actually have a look at some examples that we have seen together, actually only this one, when we saw in sense number 4 for liberal, meaning lavish. And this sentence went, I think Sam is too liberal with his criticism. This is a rather figurative way of saying he criticizes people too much. I like this that the dictionary does when it explains the meaning for something in brackets, apart from the definition, right? So, oh, this has happened again. Agony. So if you go to agony, for example, tell me now, don't prolong the agony means to make it last longer. And if you go to sentiment and it says someone says my sentiments exactly, what they mean is I agree. So what is happening here? The dictionary is explaining to us a more literal version of a more figurative, or in this case, more idiomatic way of saying something, right? Idiomatic is because I use a set of words that, once again, do not have a literal meaning, but they are used normally by native speakers, right? How do we do this? Earlier we had the definition for infer, right? We saw the definition for infer. What we're doing is to draw an inference, to deduce, right? And that's how we work out figurative language, right? But how does this inferential process work? Well, basically based on schema. That's what people like to say, right? Schema theory, the plural may be schemas or schemata, right? Because this is a word of Greek origin. This is a Greek plural. A schema is an outline of a plan or theory. And if we ask Merriam-Webster, Merriam will tell us something more specific. Sense number 2 is a mental codification of experience that includes a particular organized way of perceiving cognitively and responding to a complex situation or a set of stimuli. This is because this word comes from psychology, and Actually, the idea is that a schema is a sort of mental representation of something we know, right? And we retrieve this information, this data that is organized in our brains in sort of, people say, stereotypical patterns, so because they're very recurrent, in order to understand the world. Let me give you examples that are very simple. If you think about a university, your mental schema will think of classrooms, teachers, offices, heads, and whatnot. Even a canteen will be part of your schema. This is what we call a non-sequential schema, and sometimes referred to as a frame. So it's a set of ideas. But what if I say, you think about the schema of taking a bus, right? You're going to think of it in a sort of script, right, in a sequential matter, because you're thinking, well, I have to walk up to the stop, wait there for the bus to arrive, raise my hand when the bus arrives, and hopefully it will stop, right? Now, this schema may be activated, say, when you go to another country, not now, and you want to take a bus, and you go to the bus stop, and well, you raise your hand, because that's what your schema says. The sequence is, you go, you stand, you see the bus coming, you raise your hand. Nobody raises his or her hand at the bus stop, because that's what they have to do, right? Only, I don't know if only, but possibly only buses in Argentina, bus drivers think that the bus stop is something they can choose, right? A bus stop is for them to stop. We don't need to stop the bus. The bus has to stop. Well, I'm getting nervous, as you can see. Now, what I'm trying to explain is that the schema, in this case, remember, a script, right, has been activated, and your brain uses all this information in order to understand. But say you were in another country and you see that nobody raises his or her hand, and you're going to see a mismatch. That is to say, your script, your schema for taking a bus does not coincide with somebody else's, and you're going to accommodate the information. You're going to say, okay, in this world, in this other world, more normal world, people don't need to stop the bus because the bus has to stop. Okay? Now, this is what happens in our brains, right? We really don't know much about something else, right? I mean, we can imagine all of this, but how our brains are physically managing all of this is something we really don't know, right? But that's another thing. Okay, so we have our schema and we make sense of what we see. But well, I wanted to share with you, earlier we saw the examples of liberal, being liberal with money, don't prolong the agony, and we saw my sentiments exactly, right? These are rather figurative ways of saying something more straightforward, right? And I wanted to share also the concept of presupposition, which is another we're going to use when talking about language. This is not a technical definition, right? It says something that you believe to be true. That's not what we're going to that's not the meaning we're going to use. We are going to use another one when, for example, I say my eldest daughter is here. The presupposition linguistically is that I have at least one more child, because I have an eldest daughter. There has to be another one, right? And if I say I need another example, the word another also presupposes that I have given you one example before that one, right? So initially a presupposition should be embedded in the language, right? Whereas when I am speaking of figurative language, I am actually drawing an inference which is non-linguistic, right? That is part of maybe my schema, right? You could say that. Now, this is not always very straightforward. That is to say, to tell the difference between a presupposition and figurative language, right? Whether we're inferring or presupposing. If I say, it wasn't the dog who did this, isn't embedded in the words that it was somebody else. Or when I say we need a different approach. Clearly, when I say different, I mean there was another one, right? So that is clearly presupposed. Or if I say also now it is too late. Clearly in this now, it is being, I am spelling out that there was a time when it wasn't late. But what happens when somebody says, and this is an example I take from Pinker's The Language Instinct, when somebody says, I'm leaving you, and somebody else, the partner responds, who is he, right? Clearly, the person is inferring that the action of leaving the partner is merited by having or being with somebody else, right? Okay, or when I say out with it, right? I am using the preposition, in this case an adverb, figuratively, right? I'm using this as say something. Now, as I said, this can be a problem, right? And another very important linguist, Alan Cruz says that the fact that we don't spell everything out in language is actually a valuable feature of the language, right? Though it can lead to what we call sometimes circumlocutions, right? Double stress here, not double stress, but secondary stress and primary stress, circumlocution, right? And this is when you use more words than you actually need, right? And that is a problem, right? And it can also lead to a euphemism, which is when you find pleasant words to refer to something that is not nice, right? Whatever the case, we're using different ways of not calling a spade, right? Not calling things by their names, but rather saying something else in order to refer to them, right? Okay, I would like to leave you with some the entry from Cambridge Dictionary for figurative, and here you get the thesaurus, right, the synonyms and related words, but if you click figurative use of language, you go to this beautiful box that they give you, and you will find, for example, metaphors, and actually what you figures of speech here, figures of speech, in which you will find other expressions that are really important, right? Especially we think of metaphor, metonymy, and also synecdoche, that is not here, and also simile, right? We'll see those later, but you may want to get started. And finally, I wanted to take you to circumlocution in Merriam-Webster, when we use a necessary large number of words to express an idea or to evade, right? To not to say what we want to say, actually, just maybe not to hurt or whatever. Here's an interesting explanation for the word circumlocution, but actually I wanted to show you something else, and that is that we have a podcast about circumlocution, and this entry that is very, very nice. You talk too much, 8 words for the wordy, right? And you will find pleonasm, that's the word we use a lot. We use it in Spanish as well, pleonasmo, como cuando decimos bella caligrafía, cuando caligrafía es bella. Logorrhea, verbose, prolix, motormouth, garrulous, periphrasis, and circumlocution, right? I want to go back to periphrasis because it says here that it's the use of a longer phrasing in place of a possible shorter form of expression. And that's because later we're going to talk about periphrasis or paraphrasing language, right? Which is what we did at the very beginning with liberal or with agony. Don't prolong the agony, don't make it longer, okay? Thank you very much. That is all.